Hey, welcome back, podcast friends. And I know I've done cholesterol talks in the past on podcasts in the past, but this one, I instead of getting all confused with all the different aspects of cholesterol and LDLs and VLDLs, I just want to go straight to the ones that people are talking about. They're talking about the good cholesterol as HDLs and the bad cholesterol as LDL. So I'm here to tell you that is not true. Just so you know, cholesterol is cholesterol. It's one molecule. Okay. And cholesterol is extremely, not only is it good, it is vital for our life. We have to have cholesterol. It is so important that every single cell in our body, except red blood cells, because they don't have a nucleus, that every single cell in our body can make its own cholesterol. And it has to have cholesterol for its own survival. And in fact, the mechanism of how your cell makes cholesterol actually makes other things also that the cell has to have for its survival. So, cholesterol is so important that there's two different ways the cell can get cholesterol. It can either make it on its own, while at the same time it's making all these other things that the cell needs to survive, or it can get it from the blood supply that's going next to it. It has two different mechanisms. So if we block up one, there's supposed to be a way for your body to make other cholesterol. But anyway, I've talked all about that, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But the main thing, just to know, cholesterol is cholesterol. When they say HDL or LDLs, that is not cholesterol. And I've talked about this also. An HDL and an LDL, these are, I call them fat mobiles. All these are actual particles. They're made out of protein, a protein shell, and then it has cholesterol and triglycerides on the inside of it. And that's because fat and cholesterol, they don't mix with water, and the blood's water. So the HDL particles and the LDL particles, what those are just the vehicles that allows you to move these triglycerides and cholesterol all around the body for all the things that your body needs triglycerides and cholesterol all for. And when there is no other use for it, then these also carry them to the fat cells and put the triglycerides into the fat cells for storage. So a triglyceride is the form of fat that is used in mobilizing fat around the bloodstream. And it's also the form of fat that is used on the inside of your fat cells. Those are triglycerides. Okay. But HDL is not cholesterol. HDL is a particle of protein, cholesterol, and triglyceride. Same thing with LDL. LDL is not cholesterol. LDL is a particle of protein, triglycerides, and cholesterol. Okay. So that's the first thing to make sure you understand. But cholesterol is extremely important. Cholesterol, where fat is just a bunch of carbon, it's just a long strain of carbons and hydrogen. That's all it is, big straight chain. Cholesterol is actually like 5 different rings. So it's a different form, but it's still made out of carbon and hydrogen. So it's still a fatty chemical, but it's a fatty, waxy cholesterol. It's used different. And cholesterol, like I said, every single cell in your body makes it. Every single in your cell in your body can get it from the blood going by because it needs it so badly. And it makes up all the cell membranes, every cell. If you have any kind of damage, like you'll hear throughout this podcast, when you have damage like to a blood vessel, you need cholesterol, you need the triglycerides, you need that fat to be able to repair that area, because every single cell is made out of fat and cholesterol, the cell membrane of it. But even further than that, cholesterol is also, it's extremely important in many of our hormones like testosterone, progestin, estrogen, vitamin D, cortisol. These are extremely important and vital hormones that we have, and those are made out of cholesterol. So cholesterol is extremely important. The HDLs and the LDLs, like I said, that is not cholesterol. Those are particles. It's called a lipoprotein, and that's what it stands for. HDL stands for high density lipoprotein. LDL just means low density lipoprotein. And then there's VLDLs, very low density lipoproteins. Lipoprotein means there's fat and protein. Okay, so it's a particle. So when you hear HDL or LDL, that is not cholesterol. It's just a vehicle that carries fat and cholesterol around your body. And actually, I talked all about this. I actually did a 3-part podcast series on episodes 107, 108, and 109. And I break this all down. So I'm not going to go into that right now. Just know that a VLDL that you get measured from the doctor's office, a VLDL is what is produced in the liver. The liver puts it out in the bloodstream, and then it circulates all around the blood, giving the triglycerides and the cholesterol to all the parts needed. As it does this, it shrinks, and it goes from a very low density lipoprotein to an intermediate density lipoprotein. Once it's this way, it can go back to the liver, get more triglycerides and cholesterol, and become a VLDL again, or it can continue to stay out in the circulation, and it can give up more triglycerides and cholesterol, shrink down even more to become an LDL. Okay. Once it's an LDL, under normal circumstances, that LDL goes back to the liver. The liver puts more fat and cholesterol in it, and it bulks it back up to a VLDL again to set it back out on its way to go through the exact same cycle again. That's what happens normally. So they were checking this, and they're trying to say, okay, let's look at our LDL. And what they found is that LDL actually has immune properties also. It has antibacterial, it has an immune function. So actually what they're finding is people that have low LDLs are the ones that tend to have more sepsis, more infections, because their LDLs are too low and they can't fight this. So that's one thing, okay, that says LDLs are not bad cholesterol like everybody's saying. The other thing that LDLs do is, like I said, it carries if you are a fat burner, if you've already listened to my podcast and you've made the dietary changes, nutrition changes that you need to go from unhealthy to healthy, then what you've also learned is that what you're doing is you're eating more meat, you're eating more fat, and you're eating a lot less carbohydrates. So by doing that, you're keeping your insulin levels low. By doing that, you're actually burning the fat out of your fat cells and using that for energy instead of using glucose. And this is exactly the way we're supposed to be. So if you've done that and you become a fat burner, like we've been since the beginning of time, we just became glucose burners for our energy since the dietary guidelines came out in 1977. But if you actually if you've realized we've been hoodwinked and you've switched over and you're starting to eat healthy again, what happens is now you're using fat for your energy source. So now, since you're using fat for your energy source, you're going to have more LDLs floating around in your blood. So your LDL level is going to be high because it's moving all that fat and cholesterol around in your body to all the parts that it's needed. Okay. So what they found is people who have high LDLs, okay, what they found is that they have, what they said is, if you have a high LDL, but you also have high HDLs and you have low triglycerides, you don't have a very big chance of heart disease. But if you have high LDLs, low HDLs, and high triglycerides, okay, then they say, then you do have a higher chance of cardiovascular disease. So just to make sure that I said that right also, whether your LDLs are high or low made no difference in cardiovascular disease. What they found is if you had high LDLs along with high HDLs and low triglycerides, that's cardioprotective. High LDLs with low HDLs and high triglycerides, that was what caused cardiovascular damage. So it's really not the LDLs at all. It's the triglyceride and the HDLs. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit also. So this has nothing to do. So if you really want to be cardioprotective, what you need to do is you need to increase your HDLs and decrease your triglycerides. Very quick. How do you increase your HDLs? You eat more fat. HDLs are produced inside the intestines, and they found that people who have low fat, low cholesterol diets, they have low HDLs and they have more cardiovascular risk. People who eat more fat and more cholesterol, they tend to have higher HDLs, and it's more cardioprotective. They have less chance of cardiovascular disease. Okay. So HDLs are made in the gut and they get increased when you have a diet high in fat and high in cholesterol. That's how you increase your HDLs. Resistance training also helps that. They found that people who work out by lifting heavy things, that can increase the HDLs also. But between the two, eating a diet high in fat and cholesterol are the ones that increase the best, and you want high LDLs. The way you decrease triglycerides are made, excessive triglycerides are made from eating excess glucose, which almost everybody does because we are carbohydrate eating society. That's why we're so sick and on all these medications. But the way you get triglycerides is your body takes all the excess glucose that you eat, which is a lot, and it has to turn into triglycerides because it wants to store that as fat because it thinks that you're giving an energy source that it can't store. So it turns it into an energy source it can store for times later when you can't eat. The only problem is that time never comes because people are eating constantly all the time anymore. So we just keep on making more and more triglycerides and keep storing them in our fat cells. So if you want to decrease your triglycerides, you decrease the amount of glucose that you eat. And glucose is the basic building block of all plant-based foods. So you definitely want to decrease all man-made food and box, bottle, bag, and can. That stuff is nothing but chemicals and toxins. And even on your vegetables, on your God-made food, like fruits and vegetables, depending on how healthy you are, if you're extremely obese, you may want to stop eating those as well. Definitely, you're going to want to stop eating the vegetables that grow below the ground, the potatoes and all that, because there's a lot of glucose in that because those are made out of starch. So anyway, and I've talked about these in past podcasts, so I'm not going to go through all that. But just suffice it to say that all these things, cholesterol is extremely vital. You have to have it, and all these things that it makes is also extremely important for our survival, like the hormones that we were just talking about and neighbor cell membrane. So what does cause cardiovascular disease? What does cause this? It's pretty well known. Everybody says that the first thing that happens when you start getting cardiovascular disease, which means you are getting deterioration of the blood vessels that supply the heart. So they break down. They can't supply the heart with the oxygen and with the nutrients. And so you have a heart attack. So what causes the blood vessels to start breaking down in the first place? The first thing, everybody knows that one thing is high pressures. Okay. Anytime you have a high pressure, that and which the highest pressure you're going to have, if you have, picture your blood vessels like stream, like you're paddling a canoe down a river. Okay. So you're paddling a canoe down this river. That's like the straight part of your blood vessel. And then all of a sudden you come to a fork in the river where you can either go right or you can go left. Right where that forks off, that's called a bifurcation. Right where it bifurcates right there, right the tip of the ground where the water's hitting right before it splits, that's what's getting all the pressure. All that water's hitting right there on the peak, and it starts deteriorating that little peak away. And that's exactly what's happening in your blood vessels. As your heart pumps, it's putting all this pressure of the blood through the arteries, and the places that get affected most by this pressure is right where it first has all these bifurcations, where it goes from one artery to two. And the very first spot that happens, as soon as the left ventricle pumps, the blood goes up, it goes around your aortic arch, goes in a loop, and it goes down your back, basically. But before it ever even makes that big loop, this aorta, the biggest artery that comes out of your heart, right there, you're going to have blood vessels that go off to supply the heart. That's how important the heart is. It gets the first pick of the blood coming out of the heart. That's going to have the most oxygen and everything. However, that's also where there's going to be a lot of stress. So if you have any kind of vascular damage and now you have the heart pumping against it, this is going to cause issues. So what are the other things that happen? When you get damage in this blood vessel, you start tearing up the cells of the blood vessel. And when those cells are dying, you've got to get more stuff there to produce more blood cells or more cells of your vein or artery. You have to make more cells. So that means you need more fat, you need more cholesterol, you need amino acids for the protein because the cells are going to be full of protein. And then you also need vitamins and minerals. You need all those. So when you have damage, that puts your body in alert, and it starts sending these LDLs to that area, because your LDLs have the cholesterol that's needed to repair the damage, and it has the triglycerides that are needed to repair the damage. Then you should have amino acids floating around from your meal, and that's going to have your vitamins and minerals, and all that goes to prepare the damage. So what they found a long time ago is that when there was somebody that had a heart attack, they looked and noticed that their LDL levels were elevated. Okay. Remember, LDLs are elevated because they are going there trying to take care of the blood vessel that's been damaged. So, of course, your LDL are going to get elevated. They're trying to take care of the problem. And I've said this before. That's like saying if you drive down a highway, every time you see a major wreck, there's an ambulance there. That doesn't mean the ambulance is causing all these wrecks. They're there to help with the damage. That's what LDLs are doing also. They are there to help with the damage, to bring these things to the site that's needed. Okay. But there's a big difference. What's actually causing the pressure and what is the response to that pressure in those blood vessels. And there's different things. Inside, there's different things that can start tearing up in that blood vessel. One thing, you have what's called a glycocalyx. And I've only talked about this in a couple of the podcasts, but that is a velvet lining that lines every single one of your blood vessels. So picture this velvet lining, glycocalyx, and it has these little fuzzy protrusions out there, just like velvet. And what this does is that keeps things that are supposed to stay in the lumen of the blood vessels there, and it keeps things out of the wall of the blood vessel that's not supposed to be getting in the wall of the blood vessel. This is very important. That's a protective mechanism that your blood vessels have. However, there are things that can tear up that glycocalyx. Okay. So if you have this glycocalyx, what they found is if you have a diet that's high in carbohydrates, about an hour after you eat those meals, those carbohydrates, that glucose, remember, it gets turned to glucose. All that glucose is increased glucose is going around your blood vessels, and it starts to deteriorate that glycocalyx. They start to shrink. And now they won't be gone for long. If you can go 6 hours without eating, then the glycocalyx, they start to come back out again, and they can be protective again. However, if you know, people who eat carbohydrates, since carbohydrates have no nutritional value, and carbohydrates also there's different reasons why it makes you more hungry. What ends up happening is now you have these carbohydrates, you have all this glucose, and you have this glycocalyx. So now the glucose is going by, the glycocalyx shrinks up, and before 6 hours up, you're eating again. So now you have more glucose and more of the shrinking of the glycocalyx. So now this allows things that used to stay on the inside of the blood vessel to get into the lining of the blood vessel itself. And I'll explain why I'm saying that in just a little bit. But just remember that that's a normal response. But what damages this is when you start damaging that glycocalyx, and then when you have these high blood pressure, and then when you add to that, you add inflammation all over the body, which most of us are highly inflamed because we are taking in chemicals all the time. It's in our air, it's in our food, it's in our water. The food is the main one. If you're getting anything from a store, you're going to have chemicals all over that stuff. That's what an ingredient list is, just a list of all the chemicals that your body doesn't know what to do with it, and it's causing inflammation. And then you also have a bunch of glucose in your blood. So this glucose, anytime this glucose attaches to any protein, it's called glycation, and it starts deteriorating that protein. And glucose is, anytime you have a high glucose, you're damaging proteins all throughout your bloodstream and all throughout your body. In fact, when you go to get your glucose tested and they test your A1C, the A1C is a measure of how much glucose, basically your average glucose that you've had over the last 3 months-ish. And it's because of glucose. As the glucose is high, it attaches to the red blood cell. Well, they talk to you about this being your A1C, but the fact is that is binding to the protein in your red blood cell, making that red blood cell not work. So the higher glucose is, the higher your A1C is, the more red blood cells that you're damaging and making it to where they don't work. They can't carry the oxygen anymore. So that's a whole nother problem in and of itself. And then you also have oxidation. When you have a bunch of inflammation, you keep things out in the bloodstream, you end up getting what's called oxidation because you have all these free radicals floating around, these oxygen radicals, and they're looking to bind to things also. And after that, now you have the high insulin, and high insulin all by itself can cause all kinds of hardening of the blood vessel lining. High insulin causes damage to almost every cell in your body also. Okay. So you don't want high insulin. You don't want inflammation. You don't want high blood glucose. All those are contributing to what's going on with this plaque, with this blood vessel deterioration that you're getting. And it's very important to understand that because what you can do, it sounds like it's so mixed and there's so many things, but when you find out, really, this all goes down to one thing, and it goes down to what we eat. Okay. So they've looked at plaques. Nobody really actually knows exactly what a plaque is formed out of, but they do know that these are all the contributing factors. Patients with high plaque tend to have high CRPs, which is that C-reactive protein, and that's one of the first signs of inflammation. So as your CRP goes up, that means you have more inflammation in your body. They have deteriorated glycocalyxes. They have high blood sugar, high insulin, and some of them even have bacteria, as well as the fat and cholesterol. All that stuff is going to be all mixed up in these plaques. So what I've been saying, okay, is HDL and LDL, that is not cholesterol. Those are particles, but those are perfectly normal particles. That's how we transfer all the cholesterol and all the fat all around through our bodies. It's extremely important to know that. It's the high blood pressure and these other things that cause the blood vessel damage, and the high LDLs are just there to repair it. And again, just high blood pressure alone is enough to cause a lot of damage. And I did a whole talk on episode 8 called How Do Carbohydrates Increase Blood Pressure? And just the fact that you're eating a lot of carbs all the time, that alone can increase your blood pressure in multiple different ways. I think I'll go through 5 or 6 different ways that happens. And remember, increased blood pressure was one of the first kind of damaging thing that's going to happen to start causing blood vessel damage and cardiovascular disease. So as far as the good, the bad, and the ugly cholesterol, okay, first, HDLs, VLDLs, IDLs, LDLs, these are not cholesterol. These are particles that carry cholesterol, carry triglycerides, and they have this protein shell, okay? So calling that good or bad cholesterol makes no sense. However, the regular HDL, VLDL, IDL, and LDL, those are all good. Those are all good. Those are all normal. Those are our fat mobiles. That's just the way we get cholesterol and fat around the body. When it goes bad, okay, this is when it goes bad. When you have an LDL, that a normal LDL that you have is called a large buoyant LDL. Okay. LDL, remember, it's low density lipoprotein. That means there's a protein shell. It has cholesterol in it and it has triglycerides in it. And remember, the triglycerides come from you eating carbohydrates all the time, and all that glucose is getting turned into triglycerides. So when you eat all these, and this is the only, I've only seen this actually spelled out exactly in one book, one paper. And that's where this is coming from. That's where this, but it made so much sense. What it says is when you eat so much glucose, you are making so many triglycerides that when your liver goes to make these VLDLs, okay, and remember, a VLDL is a very low density lipoprotein. It's just a great big particle that has a protein shell and has cholesterol and triglycerides in the whole. However, when you make so many triglycerides, you tend to overproportion that, and you get a lot more triglycerides in that LDL or that VLDL than you normally would have, because we're trying to get rid of all these triglycerides. So now you have less cholesterol and more triglycerides. Now, as that VLDL goes all around and release all the cholesterol and triglycerides to all your cells, to everywhere in the body that's needed, it shrinks down to an IDL. Well, then it gives out more triglycerides, shrinks down to an LDL. But now there were so many triglycerides that when it gives up all its triglycerides, there wasn't very much cholesterol, but there were more triglycerides. Now, when it gets up to triglycerides, it shrinks to even smaller than a normal LDL. So a normal LDL is called the large buoyant LDL. The small, dense LDLs is what happens when you give up so many triglycerides because you're trying to haul so many triglycerides because you're eating so much glucose. Now it becomes very small. When this LDL becomes a small, dense LDL, that's when all the trouble starts happening. So now you have these small, dense LDLs floating around. When it goes back to the liver to dock, to go in to have more cholesterol and triglycerides added to it to turn back into a VLDL, the receptor on a small, dense LDL doesn't dock with the liver as well. So these small, dense LDLs, they stay out in your bloodstream for a lot longer period of time. When these small, dense LDLs stay out in the bloodstream for a lot longer period of time, and you are eating all this glucose that formed the small, dense LDL in the first place, now all that glucose, just like it did on your red blood cells for your A1C and like it does with all the other proteins, the glucose binds to these small, dense LDLs. It's called glycated. So now you have a glycated, small, dense LDL. Now, along with that, people who tend to eat this kind of food are also eating all these chemicals, the man-made chemicals and all the chemicals that they spray all over our fruits and vegetables. So now you have all these chemicals in your body that also increases your C-reactive protein, CRP, which means now you have a lot of inflammation. So now you have a small, dense LDL that's been glycated with the glucose, and you also have all this inflammation. So these become oxidized. So now you have an oxidized, glycated, small, dense LDL. You've got glucose floating around your bloodstream. So now your glycocalyx has shrunk down, and you have extremely high blood pressure because of all the insulin that you had that's caused, and all the carbohydrates causing blood pressure. So now when that blood vessel gets damaged by the high blood pressure, these small, dense LDLs, since the glycocalyx is gone, it can get inside there. So now you have a glycated, inflamed, small, dense LDL that's now been embedded in the blood vessel lining. And that's where all the problem comes. So now you have an intruder in your blood vessel lining, not supposed to be there. Your body sends these white blood cells to try to clear it out. And as it does, it starts causing damage with the blood vessel lining. And that's what goes into cardiovascular disease. So it is not LDLs. It's not LDLs. A normal LDL is a large buoyant LDL. It's the small, dense LDLs that got glycated, it got oxidized, it's in inflammation, it has a low decreased glycocalyx. All this comes into play, and all that is what goes into making this plaque and also making the hardening of the arteries and the cardiovascular disease. That's what's going on here. So the bad LDL is going to be the small, dense LDL. The ugly is the small, dense LDL that actually gets embedded into your blood vessel lining. That's the one that's causing all the damage. But all this can be taken care of just by taking care of your nutrition. So that's why. And again, if you go to your doctor does not know this. He doesn't learn nutrition. It's not his fault. I didn't know it either. I went to college for 11 years. I've been practicing for 35 years. I was never taught any of this. I didn't know. I was taught the same thing. High LDLs are bad. Put them on a statin. Okay. Worst thing you could do. It's the worst thing you could do. And I explained all this when I explained exactly how statins work and kill your cells one cell at a time in episode number 68 it was called What Are the Most Common Adverse Effects of Statins. And just so you know, statins they don't just have one or two adverse effects. I just counted them in my drug book that we use to dose all our patients. The physicians and pharmacists, we all use this book, Lexi Drugs, and I counted them. And for both the statins and the GLP-1 agonists, both of those have well over 70 different adverse effects associated with each one, with statins and also with the GLP-1s. So if you think it's just going to be so much easier taking a tablet, okay, please think again. There's multiple adverse effects, and high LDLs don't cause cardiovascular disease. I mean, it's been shown. In fact, now they know that there's actually been a statement that actually came out saying that cholesterol is not a nutrient of concern anymore. I mean, now they found out cholesterol is not bad, so you don't have to worry about decreasing what you eat, which goes into a whole nother thing because the cholesterol you eat and the cholesterol in your blood, two totally different cholesterols. You can eat all this cholesterol and you won't see hardly any change in your blood cholesterol. But I talked about that in another podcast also. So what happens if you do go to the doctor and you have high LDLs? First thing you want to do, what do you want to look at? You don't want to look at the LDLs. Don't even look at them because, as we said, high LDLs is a concern if you have low HDLs and high triglycerides. High LDLs are not a concern at all if you have high HDLs and low triglycerides. So what that means is don't look at the LDLs at all. Look at your triglycerides and look at your HDLs. Okay. What you want is divide the triglycerides by the HDLs, and that number should be less than 2. And really it should be closer to 1 to 1. Your HDL level and your triglyceride level should be close to the exact same. Then you can look at your total cholesterol, and your total cholesterol divided by your HDLs. You want that less than 5, and really preferably less than 3.5. But again, you're looking, so as the higher your HDLs are and the lower your triglycerides are, the better those numbers are. If your triglyceride divided by your HDLs is higher than 2, that is indicative that you have a lot more of these small, dense LDLs. That's what that's indicative of. So it's very easy to know if you've got the good large buoyant LDLs or the small, dense, bad LDLs, and you want to keep them from becoming the ugly ones. That's all you got to do is get your triglyceride level and divide by your HDLs. And that needs to be less than 2. And like I said, closer to 1 to 1. So why do the doctors do this? One, they're just going by the dosing guidelines that are written by the drug companies who are making money off the statins. Okay. But they don't know that. So they're going by the dosing guidelines. They don't have that much time. They only have about 5 minutes with you. You know, if you've gone to one, 5 or 10 minutes is about the max. They say 15, but that has to get from patient to patient. So they don't have very much time. And it is so much easier to give somebody a prescription for a medication than it is to sit there and explain all this stuff to them and explain exactly what's going on and how you can actually do this naturally. And that is almost impossible because the doctors do not know this. Some doctors do. The doctors that have, and usually the ones who do are the ones who's had an episode themselves. They've had a heart attack, or they've seen their patients that have changed their nutrition on their own, and they've seen that this actually works because it does. And those are the physicians say, hey, maybe there's more to this, and they look into it. And there are tons of physicians all around in these circles, in the low carbohydrate circles, that are becoming more and more aware of this. And so they're actually changing their practices as well. So the doctors, they're not taught about food. They're not trained about food at all. It takes too much time to explain food to you, especially if they don't know it themselves. And trying to get somebody, I was actually taught that most people do not want to change their nutrition. They don't want to change their lifestyle. So since they won't change their nutrition lifestyle, then you have to give them a tablet. That makes me so irritated because I was truly taught that. And I found out that is so much a lie. There are so many people who really are sick and they want to get healthy. They want to get off medication. They want to reverse all these diseases they have, but they just don't know how. They're just confused by all the stuff. One key, if you're confused by something you hear, look to see who's making money off what you hear. And if it's anything from a food company or drug company, guaranteed they're making lots and lots of money off you. So that's why you're getting a statin when you have a high LDL level, because nobody's looking. Nobody's trying to figure out the difference unless you actually have a reason to go and find out how you can actually do this with nutrition, and that statins are horrible for you. So in conclusion, there's no such thing as good cholesterol, bad cholesterol. Cholesterol is cholesterol. That's just a chemical that your body needs. Okay. What they're saying by saying HDLs are good and LDLs are bad, they're talking about the whole particle of protein, fat, and cholesterol. But even that is not true, as I've just shown. And now they actually know this. So all you have to do to clean all this up, get away from cholesterol meds, get away from diabetic medication, get away from high blood pressure medicine. It's all being caused by the same thing: eating too many carbohydrates, which means plant-based foods. The way you know if it's a plant-based food is you look at it and say, did this come from an animal? If it did not come from an animal, it's a plant-based food. Okay. It's that easy. So if you're looking at a nut, a bean, a grain, did those come from an animal? No, they didn't. So that's a plant. All plants are made out of glucose. So when you eat high glucose, that's when you have high insulin. That's when you have more triglycerides. That's when you have a higher chance of getting these small, dense LDLs. That's when you get inflammation in your body because of all the chemicals that they put in all this food. And it just spirals down to where if you stop eating man-made food, you stop eating all these chemical-based plants, you don't have to stop fruits and vegetables, but definitely decrease them. And you really should only eat them seasonally. If your farmer's market is not carrying them at that time, that means they're not growing. If they're not growing, you should not be eating them. So when you're eating strawberries in the middle of December, that's not natural. Most of the produce that's in the stores is not natural. They've been genetically modified and they've been sprayed with chemicals that can also affect you. So if you want fruits and vegetables, get them from your local farmer. But also, if they want to put you on a statin, first thing you want to ask them is, can you get a CAC score? That's coronary artery calcification score. If you get a CAC score, that will give you a big opening onto whether you're still healthy, no matter what your LDL say, or whether you really do have some cardiovascular issues going on. So a CAC score is always something good you can ask your physician for. And you don't even have to ask your physician. You can get your own labs. There's places where you can get your own labs where you can get things like a fasting insulin and a fasting glucose. And you can also get your inflammatory markers like CRP. So there's different things like there's one called ownyourownlabs.com. And then there's things like LabCorp. So you can go one place. And my wife actually did that. She wanted to get her fasting insulin. So she went to one place, she got her lab draw. She went to Own Your Own Labs. They sent all the paperwork that she needed so they could get the lab draw. They sent the blood into them. They analyzed it and they sent her labs back and they let her know what her insulin was. And just FYI, just a side note, right now, the medical community is telling everybody that a fasting insulin level less than 20 is fine. That is a lie. That's what they're telling everybody because they still want to eat all this glucose. Really, you want your fasting insulin level to be less than 5, and really you'd like to have it less than 3. If your insulin level is up around 20, you are already starting to see insulin resistance, and that's what you don't want. So you can't go by their labs. It really needs to be a little bit less than that. But anyway, like I said, I know this is a strong thing. I just wanted you to realize exactly what good cholesterol and bad cholesterol is. What we're being told is not true. And as I said earlier, they've actually come out in the scientific literature now saying cholesterol is not a nutrient of concern. Meaning now, even though everybody's going and saying, oh, cholesterol is bad, take these statins, even the scientific community itself has put out the word saying that's no longer true. But the doctor's still giving it, drug companies are still making it, and people are still taking it. So that's all I've got for now. And I really hope, and again, we do have a newsletter. If anybody wants, you can click on the link below and sign up for our weekly newsletter. It's totally free. You'll get this newsletter in your box every Thursday. And all I do is I take a question that's been asked me by one of my clients, and I just break it down and do a deep dive in exactly the answer to that question. So if you're interested in anything like that on your health, feel free to click on the link below. And so right now, I want to thank you guys for joining. Have a wonderful week. And as always, make simple, healthy choices to live a quality life.